Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining our session, The Check is Not in the Mail, Managing Check Processing Risk During the Pandemic. We hope that you and your loved ones are safe and healthy and appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Corporate treasurers are facing an enormous amount of added risk and complexity in managing operations as usual during this crisis. Today, Treasury Strategies and Deluxe will dive into what you can do to mitigate risk in one very important area, the processing of incoming and outgoing checks. Our presenters today include Paul LaRock, Director and Co-Head of Treasury Strategies, and Dave Robertson, Managing Director of Payment Advisory Services at Deluxe. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. This session will be about 45 minutes long. We encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen, and if time allows, we will respond at the end of the session, and if we are running short, we will follow up via email. This webinar is also being recorded, and you will receive a recording link as well as a copy of the presentation following the session. With that, I will turn it over to Paul. Paul?
Thank you, Katie. This is Paul LaRock. This is our third webinar associated with the pandemic and the economic and financial effects of that pandemic. Our first webinar was March 4th, where within the context of our standard State of the Profession presentation, we added discussion about a COVID business continuation plan and the critical elements you needed to put into that plan. On March 30th, we put together a 5-day plan of immediate next steps for treasurers over the course of those 5 days to deal with certain classes of risks. Those are displayed in front of you now: the short-term liquidity, working capital management, and operational risks. Our firm thinks of the current pandemic as a natural disaster, as in effect a viral and economic hurricane. The exponential growth and the spread of the virus is causing exponential change in the economy. Nearly all statistical measures of both the disease and the associated economic change are running behind. They are directionally correct, but they're lagging. Even something as frequent as weekly labor numbers or unemployment numbers can't keep pace with the actual spread of unemployment because of difficulties getting into state websites, which were not designed for 5,000 or 6,000% increases in that particular statistic. So we encourage you to embrace something we call exponential thinking, which is you look at the direction of a statistic associated with your business, with the economy, and you have a degree of professional skepticism regarding the magnitude of that statistic. You have to ask yourself, are the people who are gathering the data and communicating it to me in a position in terms of infrastructure and processes to really communicate the magnitude of it? So if something is going up, it is indicated going up, it probably is, but the numbers may be lagging. That's important for you to internalize that so you can act with an appropriate sense of urgency. And this webinar, like the two preceding, is done in short order. We don't wait to send large numbers of invites out. We go right to broadcasting because time is of the essence. And the operational risk with check processing that we're talking about, this is not something that's going to happen, it is happening. So complementing our earlier discussions about management of short-term liquidity and working capital management, this webinar will focus on the operational risks specific to paper in your billing and payment cycles. So we mentioned 3 things you have to think about in terms of operational risk, and top of mind is critical system user access. The earlier standard of 3 users having access to a critical system, so that one person could be on vacation, one person might be sick, and the third person could do a transaction. That's been replaced with our new standard of 5 people in 3 different physical locations. That is complemented by cross-training and process documentation so that you can bring in other people if any of them are unable to fulfill their duties. We focus on that presentation, going in a deep dive in this one about the paper processes being the most vulnerable. Each week, we're talking to, anywhere from 35 to maybe 60 treasurers across multiple industries to try to get a sense of the risk environment. And treasurers on the front lines are talking to us about either problems they have or problems they're trying to avoid associated with in-house lockbox operations, check printing and mailing operations, getting paper invoices out to customers, and bringing in paper invoices from vendors. A lot of this has to do with people in mailrooms, people in print shops, at risk of getting sick, or actually somebody does get sick. We have an anecdotal story. One of our clients had a single check print facility. Some of their employees are not on direct deposit. Somebody got sick in that print room. It had to be professionally cleaned. The other two employees who worked there had to go into 14-day quarantine. They got their payroll out, but it came out a day or two late for the paychecks. You will see us emphasizing throughout this presentation the relatively high reliability of electronic systems relative to paper-based physical systems. So we're going to be talking about developing a sequencing plan to begin moving your most critical customers and vendors to electronic billing and payment. So let's talk at a high level about overall processing risks. With me today is Dave Robertson, and Dave has a tremendous background in Treasury operations. And I think he'll be able to add to our discussion about how to think about overall risk, not the risk specific to a specific check function or a lockbox, but overall risks. We know that organizations using a single print facility for their invoices or their checks have the greatest challenge. We know that those with multiple facilities have a redundancy that reduces risks. Our insurance clients frequently use 3 or even 4 different print facilities for their claims and accounts payable checks. Those print facilities are in multiple states. So they have some of the best risk mitigation and diversification programs across industries. We also know that organizations outsourcing transactions to firms with multiple sites have reduced risk. And companies like Deluxe, large banks, are providing services that reduce risk in terms of both collections and disbursements. Now, Dave, at Deluxe, I think you have about a dozen different facilities around the country. You guys have made it through other disasters like 9/11 and others that disrupted operations. So you're, I think, really a thought leader in how to frame one's mind to think about overall risk in transaction processing. Tell us some of the things that are top of mind in your organization as you think about this.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, and this is obviously a huge focus for us. I think something like 2/3 of all of the B2B remittance traffic in Lockbox goes through either our software or our outsourced operating centers. So that's 1.8 trillion of GDP that's running through us. And so obviously it has to be incredibly resilient. So these are some frameworks which I think, obviously it's critical for us as a major part of the economy, but this is also something that I think a corporation could apply to their own operations. Obviously you pointed out the electronic methods are preferable. They're not always feasible though. It might be that a supplier or a buyer just cannot go digital, or the company may have some legacy IT issues or other issues that have prevented them from adopting digital payments. Having said that though, you really need to digitize as early in the process as possible. And that could be everything from using a scanning solution like Lockbox to grab the remittance data off of paper, but it also could be, creating an ability to ingest and parse and use the data in ACH and EDI addenda. It could be the ability to take in a PDF or an email and digitally pull data from that for purposes of grabbing remittance and invoice information. It could even be things like having robotic processes to grab data from buying portals. So once you have the data in a digital form, it really lends itself to automation, analytics, but also to the distribution of work remotely. So once you've got the data digital, obviously you want to automate as much as possible. Those companies that have straight-through processing rates in excess of 90% for cash application on the AR side are obviously not having the same challenges as companies where that's a highly manual process. To do that, though, you really need a very clear data taxonomy. You're getting all of this remittance data and payment data from various channels, various buyers. It's all different. It's all got to be mapped and put into a normative integrated data set. And that data set has to be in a secure environment that allows appropriate and distributed access. So, you know, it's one thing that if I want somebody to work on a piece of data that maybe has some pretty, you know, privacy important issues in it, it's one thing to have them work on that within the office environment, but then the IT environment has to facilitate that being accessed and manipulated from a home or a remote environment. And that kind of gets into the level of rigor that you need around the clear and transparent business rules. This is very critical for something like AR, where there's a lot of idiosyncrasies around how different remittance formats might be structured. But if you have clear and transparent business rules, you have a very clearly defined workflow. What that does is it not only gives you rigor, but it ensures that if you have to have a backup employee jump in, there's structure and documentation and the basis to manage that work. We talked a little bit about the ability to distribute and orchestrate work efforts remotely. And that could be things like having automated systems that say, you know, if condition X and Y are met, the next process stage is Z and it goes to, you know, this type of individual. Obviously, the more scale you have, the more you can invest in that kind of workflow orchestration. And Paul, I loved your comment about how, you know, in the old days, we thought of having 2 sites. And now you're saying it's, you know, 3 sites with 5 people as redundancy. You really need to have multiple operating sites. And I think this has been a challenge for smaller scale processors, whether it's a third-party provider or even a in-house corporate operation. You know, if one site is compromised, can you ship the work to another site to manage it? And, you know, if 2 sites are compromised, what happens at that point?
Yeah.
So we'll get into that in a little bit more detail, but the level of redundancy for true resiliency has really been ramped up with the pandemic.
I also think that how we think about disaster recovery programs is by definition different now, because prior to the pandemic, when corporates thought about their disaster recovery plans, they thought in terms of 1 to 3 day events. And it allowed them to get a little bit looser with the accounting, AP and AR accounting associated with financial transactions. The general idea was the accounting is probably a nice to have, but we can do it a couple days later and catch up. But in the pandemic, this is going on week after week. So you not only have to get payments out and bring payments in, you've got to wrestle with the AR and AP accounting challenges of that. The AP is easier because by definition, when you're sending out a payment, you're doing the accounting in the AP system. It's very integrated. AR is much less integrated. The checks that come in, it's good that you have the money so you can make payroll, but you have to apply them to the customer accounts. And so that's a second layer of challenge in the extended disaster period that we're all in. And I noticed that you talked about the taxonomy of data for AP and AR, indicating that you guys are successfully wrestling with that challenge.
Yeah, I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, but you raise a great point. I mean, anytime you end up with a black swan event like this, you know, until you really think about it, unless you could really envision that risk, your whole framework around what a BCP, a business contingency planning, you know, plan would have to have in place is very limited by your own experience. So when something new comes along, you really think, oh gosh, the duration is different, the magnitude is different, and the nature of what can actually function and what can be done is different as well.
Yeah, and that ties back to my earlier comment about exponential thinking, that you need to recognize the trend and understand the systems you use to measure it, or that another party uses to measure it. They're going to lag. They're going to get the direction right, but the magnitude is going to lag because people and systems can only update so fast, right? Should we turn now to we're going to talk in two pieces for the remainder of the presentation. We're going to talk about the collection side of the business and disbursement side. And so with that, let's open the collections part of the process. In the middle, you have a very simplified graphic of how a biller sends out invoices. Somebody receives it, they create the check, and they mail that in. And so we recognize at a high level that the collection risks, let's start with the billing risk. There has to be the printing and mailing of invoice. I recounted to you the story about the print room with somebody who had an infection and how that didn't operate. On the customer side, they have to receive it and process the invoice. We have an anecdotal story at one of our clients where a business executive has to go into an office building to receive the invoices that are coming into a mailroom there. They have since diverted that actually to somebody's house, so they don't have to make the trip in. But there's a challenge actually getting the incoming invoices. On the collection side, from the biller's point of view, the customer has to be in a position to print and mail that check. So good that they got the invoice, but the printing location has to be viral free in order for the employees to safely operate and create those checks and mail that out to the biller. And then now the biller is back to, again, a physical risk, is they have to receive the check and then do the AR application. And so there's a bunch of challenges associated with that people are mitigating in various ways. Dave, when you guys think about in-house physical remittance processing and how companies can think about that and mitigate those risks, what are some of the things that our listeners should think about?
You know, a lot of it really depends on things that are hard to change in the short run, like the footprint of the operation. So, you know, are you really structured in a way to redo the flow to keep people 6 feet apart? And, you know, even as work is being handed off. So what that's doing is it's putting a lot of constraints around a process that was really optimized to minimize space, minimize time, and maximize output. And it's taking a lot of cleverness to do a process reengineering and a role reengineering that maintains safe distancing procedures. What we're seeing, you know, you mentioned we have, you know, I think it's more than a dozen sites now, even just through all the acquisitions we've been doing. But in some cases, a company may have a primary and a backup site. What happens if there's an exposure event? And that event could be direct or indirect. It could be that, you know, somebody has a relative that they've been exposed to. Well, at that point, you know, you have to invoke a complete shutdown. You've got to do a thorough cleaning, and that's going to result in multiple day outages. So it really does take a lot of creativity to figure out, you know, do I need to change the floor plan? Do I need to change the shift structure? What can I move to the home? What's the minimal work that can be done? To my earlier comment, if you're digitizing early and you can basically have the staff on site that's really doing the physical interaction with the paper, but the staff that's working off of data can all be remote and, you know, safe in their own homes, you know, entirely quarantined. You know, the other thing to keep in mind is the people aspect of this. So it can be compromised not just because you're changing the work environment, but it's a lot of stress. So you're taking people that may have, you know, loved ones at risk, or, you know, loved ones that are having economic disruption, and now you're changing their work environment and you're asking them to do things in new ways and taking longer times to do it. So one thing I've noticed is that our managers are investing a lot in really helping take care of the employees, giving them resources, managing the stress levels, trying to give them certainty during these uncertain times. And I think this is important because I loved your comment about, you know, we need to move to electronic. And I think coming out of this pandemic, the shift to electronic is going to intensify. But if it were easy, we would have already done it. So to some extent, you know, what we have, and we basically have to work within it. I think one thing that we're seeing is just an unbelievable volume of requests to take on work from corporates and third-party processors, you know, such as banks, where maybe they didn't have the scale to really establish the redundancy or have the flexibility around roles and floor plan. So to some extent, this is really about making the best of a situation within your existing constraints.
I think that's a very good point, and reinforcing the human element. One of the things we're stressing is if you have to, again, think exponentially. You know, you've got the 5 people that we described in the 3 different locations. If one of them would become ill or be distracted by some personal reason, a relative or something they have to take care of, then you need to backfill them. And so the companies that have detailed written policies and procedures, particularly the procedural documents on how to process transactions at any point in the value chain, they're an advantage. The ones who don't have that, which is probably the most common, if they have something that's outdated, they need to update that and get that written up so that if people have to force themselves into cross-training, accountants acting as treasury people acting as accountants, they can do that. So there's so many things that need to be done so fast that it really is overwhelming for nearly everyone.
And Paul, you mentioned the treasury people acting as as accountants. It's even worse than that. We've seen executives working as data key operators.
What could possibly go wrong? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's lots of data keying is offshore to India, which itself is struggling with the pandemic through widespread shelter in place to protect their population. How is that affecting operations in India?
Yeah, we've heard from a lot of clients that had India operations that initially there was an entire shutdown. And part of the problem, I think, is that, you know, we take for granted how much work from home has become something that we do very well. Obviously, there's risks and issues with it, but it's something we do well. And in the US, if you're a processing operation and you need to drive work, even processing work to a home environment, you often have the structure to do that and the data security. What we're finding just, you know, from our own experience and from others is that operations in India, it was a little trickier to get that into more of a remote environment. It seems to be coming back online now, but it was not as smooth as the US environment. And so if you look at a provider that had significant offshore operations or an in-house shop, that was a real struggle. And in many cases, they were having to restructure their systems environment to better support that. But in other cases, to actually bring the work onshore and take up the time of employees that are, you know, obviously deeply stressed. And I guess as a note, the lockdown for India, it's been extended to May 3rd. So, you know, obviously, I think the operations there will continue to improve. But that's been a huge impact. And I think in terms of thinking through business contingency planning, you really do have to think, what if a whole region were to shut down? Could you move that work to another region? That's got to be part of a business contingency plan.
Yeah, and I want to apply exponential thinking right now to this example. So we're using India as an example. It's what's happening right now. But understand, those of you who've outsourced to other countries, the people in those other countries are not immune. If you're human, you can get the virus, and those around you can. So for those in China and the Philippines and Costa Rica, in Poland, they are not invulnerable to this. So what you're seeing happen in India can happen there. So again, applying exponential thinking, we think we see the trend, people get infected, it moves regionally very rapidly. So if you're fortunate enough to have operations in Poland, relatively less affected than other parts of the world right now, that does not mean it's not going to happen. It probably will, unfortunately, for those people. So you have, they and you together have to prepare for that. So you've got to watch the trend, know that the data and statistical measurement of the trend is lagging, and then act on the directional information, not the actual number. So today it's India, in a week, it'll be somewhere else. One of the things that is affecting banks in the most affected areas, I think about Michigan, New York, New Jersey, is they have to protect the employees in the branch. They have to protect the customers coming in and out of those branches. Many of them are applying the shelter-in-place protective measures. That affects corporates who have to make check deposits, correct, Dave?
Yep, absolutely, Paul. And I won't say too much about this one because it's obvious, but one study that Deluxe did found that of the checks that really ought to be going through remote deposit capture, not through a branch, only about half of them are doing that today. And so, you know, half of the other volume that's going to branches could easily go through remote capture. So it's kind of funny to think about a product that's been around for 16 years, but the adoption has only been half what it really should be.
Yeah. And so some of the potential solutions could be broken into, I think, 3 categories. And why don't you talk about those 3 categories to help our listeners understand how they can have some practical implementation steps.
Thanks, Paul. And this is just some of the things we're seeing in the market. You know, obviously, some of the shops that have the ability to do backup procedures are able to continue working, and that's great, and they can continue to manage those processes safely. In other cases, we are starting to see some of the smaller operations fail. And the challenge is, you know, if you're thinking about who to bring that work to in a pinch, it's not only a case of, you know, can they take it, but if you give it to them, what's going to keep you from, you know, failing with that provider down the line? You know, to your point of exponential thinking, you know, if this goes on for another month, are we going to start to see some failures? So there is a small set of very robust providers out there that do have a capacity to take on outsourced remittance processing work. I know for us personally, you know, it's more triage mode. So, you know, where you have that great relationship and that strength of relationship, not only, you know, in some cases, maybe outsourcing fully, which, you know, is challenging to do, but might be your only solution. We're also seeing a really interesting development where some shops are moving 30 to 50% of their work to outsourcing. And what that's doing is that's relieving the strain. So even if they have let's say a processing site shut down, they now have a better ability to manage that impact because there's less stress on their overall operations. So that's one thing that I think is a really intriguing strategy is I don't want to outsource this completely, but I'd like to bring in somebody else to take away some of the stress for me. And in many cases, that's more realistic for an outsourced provider to take on anyway in this kind of environment.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the second thing we're seeing is, you know, to your point around digitization, you could also add you need to automate. And I think that's never been more true than now because all of the extra work around managing this risk, you need smart FTE that are able to address that. And if the FTE are buried in operational processes, you know, that's not going to work. So we've been doing a lot of work with both banks and with corporations and just helping them automate the entire accounts receivable process. And generally what that does is that it kind of shifts AR from a processing operation to more of a knowledge-based operation, similar to what you'd find in Treasury. So if you can automate not only the cash application, but also the capture of all that data and the normalization of it, that's going to be a way to reduce your exposure to manual processing. It's going to free you up, but it's also going to free up staff that can then begin to work on some of the more thorny issues. You know, for example, the amount of credit risk in the portfolio has just got to be intense right now. And people need help. Do you give them more credit line? And at what point does that become too great an exposure of capital? If your folks are, you know, just massively churning manual work, they don't have time for those real critical analyses. And then we have good old remote capture. And so we're seeing a couple things happen. You know, sometimes companies may have remote capture. They may be supplementing it with mobile capture. They may even be having a scanner mailed to an employee site. So the employee can have the mail redirected there and actually manage the scanning. We're also seeing banks step up. It's been really rewarding for us to work with our bank partners. Their number one focus has been, let's help our clients first. And, you know, That's going to maintain our franchise value, and in the long run, that's going to make us money. But the focus right now is let's take care of our customers. Many of them are running promotions where customers that could benefit from remote capture, they are giving them pricing breaks to make it very easy for them to adopt. And they're doing things like sending them scanners that do not require drivers to install, so the installation is quite easy. So those are some elements of how we're seeing the banks step up to help their corporate clients.
Yesterday, I was talking to a CFO of a large health system, and she and I were reflecting back on the state of technology in the early 90s, and had this disaster happen in the early 90s, it would have predated the cell phones, it would have predated the technology that we're using right now to do this webinar, and it would have been even worse than it is today. The technology is a tool that makes it less bad in terms of doing business operations. I think we can, as finance professionals, be inspired by the approach of the medical community to the health side of the pandemic, where they are pursuing multiple vaccines at once, not one, not two, not three, but dozens. Complementing that, they're also trying to execute testing regimes that will allow them to identify and isolate the virus. And so by taking a multi-prong approach, thinking about that, one is a little bit longer term, one's a little bit shorter term, I could envision companies using groups of scanners to process the checks, while using employees' cell phones at home to photograph the remittance documents and forward that on to people in yet another house who have access to an accounting system. And so on the fly, we can use the technology of scanning, the technology of the phones so many of us have, to take pictures of documents, which then could be sent to somebody else's house for them to do the AR updating. That's the short term. The longer term would be, of course, outsourcing or trying to go paper to electronic as fast as you can. So taking a multi-tier approach, one short term, one a little bit longer term, hopefully will help people get through the pandemic. Let's talk about the other side of our business. We've got to pay our bills. It's good to have the customers pay us. Now we have to pay somebody else. This slide will look familiar to you. This is the managing paper disbursement processing risk. It is nearly identical to the collection risk because it is all the same process, just looked at from a different point of view. So again, the billing risks, as I said before, are the printing and mailing of invoices, having the customer receive that. On the collection side, it's the biller receiving the check and processing that. And so it's the same workflow viewed from two different points of view. AP and AR, obviously, two sides of the same coin. So there's a need to shift the work to remote environments. Again, we can't go into the office buildings, can't use the print centers the way we normally do, or we are forced to use those print centers and take precautions in terms of separation of employees, wearing gloves and masks. Dave, what are some of your thoughts about invoice printing to start the process?
Yeah, so if we look across the board, the check remittance and the invoice printing operations, if it is a physical site and if that site is part of the shutdown, we've certainly been hearing from some companies and banks with customers where there's been a panic because their check and remittance and invoice printing operations have ground to a halt. And they may not have the ability with their counterparties to really execute electronic payments. So this is one area where it's very interesting. We had a solution that has been growing rapidly. It goes back quite a ways. We originally just sold it word of mouth to small businesses, but it's now become a very large product. And it basically takes a physical check and remittance printing operation and turns it into an electronic environment in a very simple way. And so if we go ahead to that, I'll show you kind of the mechanics of how that works. And this is just one example of how you might digitize the check operations. There might be others out there as well, but this is called Deluxe Payment Exchange. And some people may have known it in the past as eCheck. the nice thing about this is it effectively executes a check print run, a check remittance print run, without any human intervention. No human hands need to touch anything. So basically, it takes the electronic feed that would have gone into a print system, and if there's an email, it sends the payment electronically through email. If there's not an email, it goes to our print and mail shop, and we are securely doing the print and mail of that check environment. When the payee gets this payment as a secure link, they have the choice to either print a check, which can be scanned and deposited, or they can have the choice of switching to another payment vehicle. So, they could ask for it to be sent via ACH. They can even take it in through PayPal, debit card, just a ton of options. They keep expanding every month as we add new payment vehicles.
I think that flexibility in payment conversion by the payee is an important attribute of these types of solutions, because again, we're working very, very quickly to mitigate these problems. You don't have time to have long discussions with every one of your vendors. And so a relatively brief discussion complemented with flexibility driven by the payee makes this type of solution to a disbursement problem especially relatively easy to implement for both the payer and the payee. Here's an upside down check.
That's a great point, Paul. And just to build on that, if you think from your experience, all the improvements in AP, oftentimes they're very AP centric, right? You need to go to my buyer portal. You need to take the payment the way I want to make it to you. And so a lot of the challenges in AR are a result of things that AP has done. And that's why you have the term the power payer, where the power payer says, do it my way or you don't get paid. This is a nice turnaround with Payee Choice, where you're actually treating your suppliers like a customer and giving them options rather than saying, thou must be paid in this manner. So this is upside down check, which it's always funny to see this, and people are like, why is that check upside down? And there's actually a very good reason.
It's a very good reason.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is.
The most sensitive part of the check is the microline, right?
Exactly. And, the microline is really not used anymore in processing. If it is being used, I'd love to hear from the obscure credit union that's still reading micro on check processing. It's really image-based processing now. So, but the main issue is if somebody were to take this to a teller line and feed it through a scanner, when you have the bottom as the top edge, that's a nice flat edge. So it's going to run through the scanner and not jam. So that's why we have people cut the top. So, if somebody got this e-payment through Deluxe Payment Exchange and they didn't want to bother with ACH or PayPal or loading it onto a debit card or any other number of options, they could simply just cut this check. They could scan it. They could, drive to an ATM. They could deposit it just like any check. And legally, it is a check. So it's, all the safeguards and protections of a check. And it creates a positive payee file. So on the back end, it's all risk protected as well.
If this
so that's what that literally looks like.
If this came to my house, again using our distributed technology idea, I have a phone. I can take a picture of this check. In many cases, I can deposit the check using my phone, can't I?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen banks and other providers promote this by sending their customers a payment this way. So they might send them a $1 payment. If they want to go crazy, they could send them a $5 payment, and then they see how easily this works. So this has really blown up during the pandemic. We've seen incredible demand for this, and it was already growing, pretty much tripling each year, along with the medical payment exchange, and it's accelerated even further. So this is all of the payee choice that you mentioned as to how they want to receive the payment.
Okay.
If we skip ahead.
And that's what gives the flexibility. Okay. Okay. So some of the potential solution applications, we can provide remote check production for
Mhm.
corporations? What are some of the other things that can be done?
Yeah, so this could also be remote remittance. So, if you think about it, rather than having to physically print and mail a remittance, you could send that as a PDF or an electronic file. That's been a huge application in the healthcare space, often for out-of-network claims payments. And it could also be used for catastrophic failure. So we've seen companies use this as a way to send out a same-day payroll if for some reason there was an inability to generate the payroll file.
Okay.
And with banks, we're seeing banks make this available to their customers. So in the last couple of weeks, 2 banks have just linked to the solution within their secure portal so that their customers have a pandemic-ready solution to continue to make check payments and not have all the risks of the physical production in their own site.
And this solution has the important quality of rapid enrollment, which again, because everything is changing so fast, so many people in so many different finance departments have to react so quickly to this. And let's face it, Treasury departments and finance in general, these have been leanly staffed for years, okay? So they don't have a lot of special projects people to oversee this. So anything a bank or a third party can do to accelerate enrollment, to shift people away from high-risk payment processes, that's a great thing. Let's talk about a checklist we want to provide you. So top of mind is it's great to talk about all these changes. You have to have access to the system. So again, we're reinforcing multiple users, 5 and 3 different physical locations. On the collection side, we would advocate moving paper to electronic through a developed logical sequencing. Biggest customers first, most important vendors first. You can't do it all at once, but you can start, do a few a day. You can complement that by some of the shorter term, more rapidly deployed solutions that Dave described. There has to be a redundancy for in-house lockbox processes, and I'm speaking about those generically. So if you don't have a formal in-house lockbox process, the idea of in your office taking in checks, scanning them, that has to be rethought. And I think the vast majority of businesses have already executed on that. I think most of the people we talked to over the past week who were using scanners in offices, those scanners have been redeployed to employees' homes. And then the next step, which we have not talked about extensively, is having a redundancy to those homes in case somebody gets sick. Who sends the scanner to who? So you have to have this triple or quadruple redundancy to accommodate the rapid growth in the disease. So again, you have to apply exponential thinking. You've got to think. You can't have a failure of imagination. You have to think scary things and find out ways to manage those scary events. On the disbursement side, again, the paper to electronic conversion being done in a logical sequencing, and then establishing redundancy for those in-house check printing functions, either by going to a third-party provider like Deluxe, approaching a bank for assistance, or using your own internal systems. If you're a big company of multiple facilities, you have to ensure that those facilities can do load balancing between them. So testing of something you're not actually using is important to get ready for the exponential event when the outer bands of the hurricane hit your physical location. You're ready to go and deal with that. Okay, time for some survey questions. I thank you all for joining us today. We really hope that this was helpful to you. We're doing our best to think about the risks in financial transaction processing and trying to get out quickly information that we hope you'll utilize and incorporate into your own fast-moving mitigation efforts. If you would like us to contact you, feel free to talk to us about Treasury Advisory Services by clicking on that button. If you would like to talk to somebody at Deluxe about the specific product solutions described in this webinar, you're welcome to click on that button. And if you need to be left alone, to do your work. We respect that. We're not going to reach out to you if you don't want us to reach out to you. So thank you all. Stay healthy and best of luck to everybody.